So hey guys, I said that I would probably stream again today, and now here we are, and we're looking at streaming again. So for those of you who tuned in earlier, we did episode 17, or session 17 of our solo RPG series, kicking that back off with Leah, in which everybody but the mule fell in a hole. It fell in a sinkhole, which was not how I was expecting that to go. But that's, I guess, how it goes. So, yeah, that was interesting. I'm glad to be back on that series. We had a bit of a hiatus, almost a 2-month hiatus, wow, due to some technical issues and then trying to figure out how to get back into it. But now we've got that up and running again, and I'm really glad to have it up and running again. So, but what are we going to do today? That is a very good question. So today I wanted to talk about, this is actually a thing I've been working on for a couple of days, talking about sort of like settlements specifically for D&D and other sort of fantasy or historical medieval-esque, Renaissance-esque sort of RPGs, tabletop RPGs. Sort of like what kind of goes into that. So, in truth, well, let me start off by saying what we're going to do. So I want to talk about sort of about the designs, some of the ways that I design settlements, and we'll kind of go through some of that. I think we're going to make a settlement. We might make more than one, kind of depends on the time. I also have an example that I sort of made previously that we can kind of take a look at so we can kind of get a feel for sort of what this sort of process does. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So I guess we should just go ahead and hop into it. So one of the first things that I want to talk about is about the 5 R's of settlement. So we talk about sort of like practical settlement design, especially when it comes to sort of D&D and tabletop games in general, is that all the sort of fluff about the settlement, we don't necessarily really need to know like how many bakers there are in the town. We don't necessarily need to know, you know, how many shoemakers there are, coopers. Generally, you don't need to know like how many priests there are, or how many temples there are most of the time, right? Anything like that. We really only need to know, as far as it's concerned for your players at the table, we really only need basically settlements to do 5 things. We need, and that what I call the 5 R's of practical settlement design. That's rewards, rest and repast, resupply, research, and recreation. So that's it. Those are the 5 things. If you have a way to do those 5 things in whatever settlement you're in, whether that's a tiny little village all the way up to sort of like a mega city, then you're going to have everything that your players are going to be looking for in a settlement when they visit there, no matter what size it is. So what does that look like exactly? So the first point is rewards, which is basically you need a place in the settlement for people to turn in, for your players to basically turn in their quests and receive rewards for what they've done. Right, because they're out, basically, right, the basic structure of D&D in most games is that you get a quest from someplace, you go out and you do that quest, because most D&D quests are location-based adventures, so you're usually going someplace and then coming back from it. So you're going to go to that place, do the dungeon or whatever it is, and come back with, to give basically a debrief, a report on how you did in that dungeon or adventure and how you've, solved all the problems. And so you need that. That's one of the things you need. Second thing is rest and repast. So one of the things that most players are looking for their player characters in any sort of settlement is a safe place for them to basically take an extended rest in 5e. As far as 5e is concerned, that's an extended rest, right? So they want a place where they can go to and they can rest, and they don't have to worry about, monsters kicking down the door and trying to kill them. Very easy. And also a place where they can get a meal and that sort of thing. And so the third point, the third R, is resupply, which is a place where the PCs can turn any coin that they have or any treasure they found in the dungeon and turn that into extra gear and supplies, right? They basically want to go shopping, right? Then that could be healing potions, it could be trying to search for magic items, it could be buying rations, all those sorts of things. Maybe buying a donkey or a horse or a cart or who knows, right? Depending on what they need. But just some way for them to be able to get at least some of the basics back, right? At least be able to sort of like replenish rations and things like that, buy more oil for their lamps and lanterns and that sort of thing. And the fourth part is research. That's the fourth R. And this is a way for the PCs to learn something new. That can be rumors, it can be adventure hooks, it can be clues for the quests they're working on. So, right, this is a good way to sort of like fold in that Sage background, specifically in 5e D&D, where it says, right, the Sage background, basically the feature of it is that if you don't know the answer to the question, you know a person or place that can give you the answer to that question. And so being able to be like, right, for research purposes, that could be some sort of like library, it could be, sort of like an elder in the town who has very good knowledge of the local area, that sort of thing. Just having some sort of place or person who's going to be able to provide that sort of information, as well as being able to give out like those rumors and adventure hooks and things, other things for your players to do in the game. And then the fifth R is recreation. And that means and this kind of falls back into rest, not only the ability to do sort of like a long rest for one night, but to be able to take like maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks, even a few months off, and have the PCs be able to relax, have some sort of fun that they can have, some sort of activities and cool things they can do, and have them sort of specifically engage with sort of like the downtime aspects of 5e, for sure. So those things where they're like trying to learn a new skill proficiency, or maybe they're trying to craft an item, things like that. Or maybe they're just trying to maybe they're trying to curry the favor of sort of like an important NPC in your world that's in that area, things like that. So yeah, and that's really everything that you need to know for creating settlements on the fly, especially on the fly, but in general for your games. Like I said, that those sort of things about like how many monks are in the cloister isn't really that important. How many guards are in the city? Like that sort of stuff's really not that important, because in general, your players are only looking for those really basic 5 things to get out of any sort of settlement that they stop in, from your smallest sort of hamlet all the way up to your largest capital city. They're really generally only looking for those 5 things. And so if you can find a way to give them that, even if it's like in a small like breadcrumb kind of way. For example, if you have players that are like 5th level and they're stopping off at some random village somewhere, and then you have one player that's trying to crack some sort of, let's say, a cipher or something like that, some sort of coded message clue they'd gotten for an adventure that's ongoing. I mean, probably there's not a real thing that is any sort of like actual tangible resource as far as like an institution in like a small village that's going to be able to handle that. But maybe there is somebody who recognizes like one of the symbols, if it's like a symbol kind of thing, and be like, oh, I think this was something like this, and give them at least like one little like breadcrumb of a hint, and then that's going to make them feel like they spent that time, that downtime specifically, in checking on this, even though it was a really tiny village. Like that they still made progress on what they were doing. And that's sort of what we want sort of in D&D, right? Is we want to reward specifically clever play. So and thoughtful play. So if your players are like, oh, well, we still need to figure this out. Well, let me just ask around. Let me spend my time asking around to see if anybody knows anything about that. If you can give them, right, you don't have to spill out the whole thing, but if you can give them just like that little breadcrumb, they're really going to appreciate it, and that's going to reward them for that action, so they're more likely to do it in the future, which can really help alleviate a lot of that sort of like DM problem where you're like, I just wish they asked somebody anything about things, right? And sort of like they were figuring out things rather than sort of relying on the DM to sort of like drop things in their lap, which can be frustrating as DM when you feel like every time that you set out some sort of problem or adventure or something for your players, and you feel like they just kind of like throw up their hands and then like, we'll just wait until the DM tells us what the answer is, right? That's not what we want out of the game, right? That's not what we want for our players to want out of the game either, most of the time. So, like I said, the 5 R's are basically the basics that are the like fundamental basics that you need for any settlement, basically, in any TTRPG. But obviously, we probably want to do more than that, right? Especially if we're doing it in prep, specifically. So, I've talked about a number of different settlements so far. So, what is sort of the hierarchy of settlements? Right, we've talked about hamlets and villages and cities, but there's also capitals, and there's also what I call steadings, which are a little bit different. So the hierarchy kind of goes like this. So on the low end, you have hamlets, which have about, the way that I have the thing structured, is that that's a population of about 50 to 400 people that live there. And so it's a relatively very, very small community. But it is a community of people that's enough that you probably don't have everyday contact with everybody in that settlement, right? So one step up from that is a village that has about 400 to 1,000 people. So this is the part where you're starting to get, the community's starting to get a large enough population that there are a pretty significant amount of specialized labor that's going on, right? Not everybody is a farmer anymore. Not everybody is a fisherman and a farmer. They're not people who are just focused on producing food, right? You have people that have specialized trades then. And then we have a big range from 1,000 to about 60,000, which is what I put in the bands for cities. So this is enough that, right, basically once they reach this point, most of the food they get is sort of from the surrounding area, and is produced usually by villages and hamlets outside of the city itself. So the people in the city are more trade focused, and this is when cities usually only happen at some sort of trade junction. That might be a bridge crossing, a point that's an end of navigation on a river, so that might be all the way down, like sort of in the delta, where the river meets the sea, right? There's usually a big city there, or it might be all the way up at basically what we call the end of navigation point, which is basically the furthest that boats can go up a river. And then at that point they have to stop and they have to unload things onto, beasts of burden, carts, wagons, that sort of thing. So anyway, that's sort of like a trade breakpoint where we have to change the mode of transport for goods is usually where cities tend to happen. Or at places, like I said, like a bridge over a river. Well, right, you don't have to unload the carts and wagons there, but you're going to funnel so much transport through such a small area that there's likely to be a large population that grows up to sort of service those people going back and forth. And then above cities are what I call capital cities. They're capitals. And this doesn't necessarily mean capital with an O, which means like the head of government, but a capital with an A, which just means that it's an incredibly important city. So this is your sort of, as far as things are concerned, kind of a New York City, a Paris, a Seoul, that sort of thing. Like very, very large, very, very sort of important cities. And usually most of these capital cities have a very specific have like a specific sort of tie to them, right? If that makes sense. So they have something that's very specific, like for Paris, you might be, oh, right, it's a fashion capital, right? Considered a fashion capital, among many other things. New York City is very much a business capital, right? So when you think about it, that means like these are capital cities, not only in that they are big cities and important cities as far as government's concerned, but they're also very influential as far as culture is concerned, right? They're sort of like the hubs for culture as well in society. And sort of the decisions that are made in those specific cities sort of ripple out into smaller areas. So I also want to talk about two other types, and those are steadings. So I said that hamlets were basically 50 to 400. Steadings are basically anything that's up to 50. And these are really, really sort of tiny settlements. They're often one or more sort of like extended families that are living together, either on sort of like an isolated sort of farmstead, like a freeholding, or they're attached to another entity, like maybe, like I said, a crossing, a noble's manor, a temple's a good one, right? Anything. So these sort of places sort of spring up around where people are already kind of going to anyways. And that kind of leads us into towns. So I hadn't said anything about towns. And because towns are kind of exist in a weird space. So traditionally what sort of created a town in sort of that medieval Renaissance sort of era was basically a charter, right? Was one of the main things. And the ability usually to hold its own market. So that's not really a super great criteria in my estimation for world building. That's a little bit more fiddly than I want to get into most of the time. So for me, I think about towns in sort of the boom town essence, which something I'm more familiar with personally, which is sort of, these are sort of, towns are basically hamlets and villages in population, but they have the services of a city, basically. And by that I mean that they basically boom, they grow up around institutions that have some sort of like outside wealth from the general area that's above what's expected. So that could be, right, like a gold rush kind of thing. It might be like there's a very large fortification there, so there are soldiers with a bunch of sort of like coin money to spend. And so then you see a bunch of sort of professional services, right? Artisans and the like that kind of show up in places that otherwise, population-wise, wouldn't be able to support that sort of density of service. And that's basically what I think about towns. So towns are really just depend on what they're attached to, more than being like a specific band that sits between village and city just based off of population. So I didn't really want to do that with it. So I kind of break that out and be like, okay, well, township's something very sort of different, if that makes sense. So yeah, one of the things I want to talk about is that if this sort of thing interests you, I would suggest that you check out, and let me pull it up. I'll actually pull it up so you guys can see it. Hold on. There we go. I would suggest looking up Made Easy. So that's Medieval Demographics Made Easy. I mean, you can find this. It's basically a PDF that you can find in a number of different websites. It's very simple. I think it's like 6 or 7 pages. Yeah, 6 pages. Super simple. It kind of goes in, and this is sort of like a historically backed source for taking a look at demographics and like what sort of things to expect in different areas, and like how many castles should be in a place, how many towns should be in a place, how many settlements, how far apart should they be. what sort of crafts people are in that area, right? We have this one right here, which is sort of like my favorite part about it. That light went out. I knew it was going to go out, and it went out. It's alright. I'll turn the overhead light on in just a second. But yeah, so it kind of gives you an idea, but one of the things that I want to definitely kind of warn you about is that it's a good resource, but it's not a perfect resource. It's definitely it's a good enough resource. It kind of gives you a quasi-realistic settlement for sort of that medieval, late medieval, Renaissance era kind of feel. European Renaissance medieval times, right? But you need to take it with plenty of salt, because that information is basically primarily based on one source citing 1 year in one specific geographic area, and that is Paris 1292, the Domesday Book, which is basically the tax records for that time. So it's a really great resource as far as sort of like getting you in the general vicinity. Like if you're playing darts, it's good enough to get your dart on the board instead of like in somebody's butt, but it's probably not going to get you to the bullseye necessarily, if that makes sense. And it does, because it's this particular place and particular time, it does kind of come with some pretty big issues. Like, for example, as far as businesses are concerned, in medieval demographics made easy, the most common business is shoemakers. But that's because Paris was exporting a large number of sort of like high fashion shoes during that time. Not because people really, really, really needed shoes more than other times during history than they needed other necessarily services. So there's that to think about. There's another big one. It kind of jumped out at me. What was it? I'm looking at it still right now. Oh, it's goldsmiths. Right, jewelers and goldsmiths, things like that. Because it's a major city during that time, during the late medieval time, right? It's a capital city. And so with a very large population, with a very affluent population of, nobility and well-to-do sort of bourgeois, it has significantly higher amounts of like things like jewelers and goldsmiths than would otherwise be normal. So you kind of have to take that sort of thing into account. So, it's a great resource, but it's not a perfect resource. So if you don't want things to show up, like jewelers are surprisingly low, almost as low as shoemakers on the merchants list and services list, which is surprising, right? That would be very surprising. Let's see, what else? Where we're going to go on to next? Oh yeah. So yeah, that's basically sort of the background. So, but I'm sure you weren't here to talk about sort of like the 5 R's, and I'll bring this up real quick, because I should have done this when I pulled it up earlier. But obviously, on the website, I've written a longer blog about this about a year ago that kind of goes a little bit more into the 5 R's, right? Kind of talk about them in process. So if you're interested in that, you can go to the website, that's redragonfiend.com, and check it out. This one specifically is /practical settlement design D&D. So if you're looking for this specific article, or if you just search for it, you should probably come up with this pretty quickly. So what I think what I want to do next is probably, I kind of talked about sort of the basics and overalls, but let's actually look at kind of what goes into, at least from my perspective, goes into building a settlement, especially if it's a settlement that you're going to use like more than once. If it's going to be a place that's going to, specifically that's going to be like a home base for the players that they're going to be in and out of again and again and again, this is going to be really good stuff to know. And so I have a creation document. I also have a larger sort of like personal reference for settlements that's about 40 pages, so it's pretty big. We're not going to go through that full thing. That thing's its own beast. We'll go through sort of like the settlement creation document that I have, which I don't think is up on DriveThruRPG. with some of my other stuff. But if you're interested in that, let me know, and I'll definitely, clean this up and get it formatted and put it up there. But it is something that I just kind of use for myself most of the time. But before we jump into that, I'm going to take a quick bio break, and then I'll come back and we will start on the settlement creation thing. And I've got an example, so I want to show you guys the example first, so you can kind of see what we're looking for, and then we'll build something. Does that sound good? Cool. I'll see you guys in a few minutes. Alright, get back to it. So I wanted to show off first. First, I wanted to show off the settlement bit we were talking about. Hold on. One moment, please. Alright, here we go. I don't know how well you can see that guy. Pretty small. Unfortunately, that's not going to increase the size. Sure. But yeah, so this kind of is just a very small settlement that I had created. It's actually a steading itself, named Besset. It's a steading. It's got a population of about 20 people, a buying power of about 2 gold. It's set up in a temperate forest on a coastal island. Has a religious leadership, and it's not known for anything sort of important. It's definitely sort of like a tucked out of the way kind of spot. Just sort of like on a small island, just kind of off the coast. And as far as defense goes, they have a sort of wattle fence and a watchtower that kind of stands next to the entrance. And then we have some punishments. So for minor infractions, there's usually a fine, and for major infractions, there's usually banishment. People get exiled. And then we have some VIP NPCs. These sort of like the movers and shakers of the community, which I always like to include, which is sort of, we have the community and worship leader. And it's important that I have the note in here that they're of the laity, so they're not ordained, they're not a priest or anything. They're just sort of a layman person who also tends to lead sort of like the community's religious sort of spiritual sort of endeavors, in addition to being the actual leader of it. So, in addition to that, we have a sympathetic outsider. And the third VIP NPC we have is a young fisher. And I have some other info in here right here. I have sibling to the dead, because, and I think we'll see this when we're building one live. But you start to see, as I'm building them, as we're going to build them together, you're going to see that the sort of adventure hooks kind of make themselves. So in this one, it turns out that, well, there's other stuff going on. And so the young fisher is a sibling to a dead person. And so then I have, basically what I do is I make a 3-point history for sort of the place, just so there's stuff for people to talk about. So the current event, sort of what's happening right now, is that the area is kind of going through some extreme rain and flooding. In recent history, so that means sort of in the last few years, there was a rival settlement, and we thought it was probably a coastal stilt fisherstead, which basically is a village that has the homes basically out over the water. And there's basically sort of a wooden walkway that goes to it, and those sort of huts sit on stilts in the water. And thought that there's sort of a Hatfield and McCoy's kind of vibe. There's definitely these settlements kind of have some, kind of violent past to them. But it's also important that that settlement no longer exists. And then sort of we have an old history, which means like only the oldest members in the current settlement remember this, like experience this, and that's that there was a very large forest fire that happened on the island. And then after that, we just have like to knock out sort of like what's in the general sort of like compass directions, ordinal and cardinal directions, sort of what is the closest thing that's worth maybe that we can use as like rumors, adventure hooks, places for people to go investigate, that sort of thing, and how far away are they. So 11 leagues to the north, so about 11 hours to travel northward, there's a religious location. It's a shrine. To the northeast, about 6 leagues away, there is a haven, and so a travel haven. So for this, we put an old cabin that's kind of supplied up. To the east, 7 leagues, we have ruins. That's the ruins of the other rival settlement, which we also found out was sort of a sort of religious commune. So very interesting that the people in Besset actually, and we wouldn't know this, I wouldn't give this to players when they first showed up. Like, they would have to investigate, and then they would uncover that people here basically destroyed that other village, and it was like as far as we can tell, a peaceful religious commune. And to the southeast, about 4 leagues away, there's a ferry, so that's a ferry that goes from the island to the mainland. And then straight to the south, 8 leagues away, there's some sort of armed conflict that was going. So I ended up doing some extra rolls for this, and I came up basically with some sort of armed conflict between some hunters and these hunters, monster hunters that are going after a Burberlane, which is a sort of fiend. And then because it's an island, to the southwest, west, and northwest, we have the sea. So there's nothing of importance there. It's just open sea. So this kind of gives you an idea of, like, when I'm building a settlement, the sort of things that I'm going to include in it, which is really, really useful. And I definitely use what's behind this, by the way. Yeah, there we go. Let me see if that's it. I've already got it saved. What we've got behind it is using sort of like the random settlement creation. I closed that, but I'm going to need it. So yeah, that's what I think we'll do here. Is kind of we'll go through this and we'll make our own settlement. And if you guys have any questions about that, you know, drop into the chat, go through it. Because I'll probably move through this maybe a little quickly, just because I'm kind of familiar with it. But we've already looked at this, we've already looked at this. And then I've got this other settlement document, the big sort of 40-pager open, in case we want to take a look at some extra sort of things. But yeah, let's go ahead and do that, and work this up. There we go. Alright, the first thing we're going to decide on is the settlement size. Since we're just kind of building something randomly. Alright, 10, which I think is the city, right? Alright, so we're making a city. So we know that our city's got somewhere between 1,000 and 60,000 people in it. So an easy way to do that is we can roll a d60 right here. So it's got about 20,000 people in it. Which means that it has a BP of about 200. So you might be asking, what's BP? That's a good question. I can spell population for sure. I know how to spell. I'm edumacated. Yeah, so population, pretty self-explanatory, but the buying power is basically the economic power of a settlement. And the way I determine that is that it's just It's simply 10%. Sorry, 10%? 1%. No, it should be 2,000. I thought that number was low. That's why. There we go. 1,000 GP. I was about to say that. The number seems really low in my head. So it's basically 10% of the population. So we have a population of about 20,000, which means that you can buy and sell goods and services up to about 2,000. That means there's going to be somebody there with enough money to be able to either purchase that or be able to facilitate the player's character's purchase of whatever that is. So, for instance, let me grab my DM binder. We've gone over this many times, but let's take a look, because I want to just look at the shopping prices for something that's relatively expensive but mundane. I'm still looking. All right, yeah. So here's an idea. So plate armor costs about 1,500 gold pieces, which means that you need to go to a city with a population of about 15,000 to definitively find somebody who's going to be able to make that for you, right? Because it's got to be made. And plate armor is super expensive, takes a lot of time to make. And so that's why it's set up that way. But this is a city, and because it's a city, there are some things that that you won't be able to find here. But most of those things are going to be like big ticket purchases. Those are going to be like our... basically at this point we're looking at ships. So basically you're not going to be able to buy ships. That's pretty much, as far as normal adventuring equipment is concerned, in a city that's got that many people in it, basically the only thing that you won't be able to buy, just sort of like very easily, is going to be ships. Because all the ships are in the thousands, if not tens of thousands range, as far as gold pieces. So those are not easy to find. But something like a keelboat that I was just looking at is about 3,000 gold. So you might find somebody on the island that has one. There's like a 2 out of 3. There's like a 67% chance that you might find somebody who's willing to part with a keelboat that your player characters could buy. If you want to look at it that way. And again, if you want to know about the math about that, again, I say check out the Medieval Demographics Made Easy, because it kind of goes into the SB and like being able to sort of percentage things out that way. Basically, we take our 2,000 gold over the 3,000 cost, and then we could roll a D100. Since we've already got it up, let's do this. Could I buy a keelboat here? All right, that's a 30. That's under 67, so yes. If I wanted to, would be able to buy one. And you can do that for all the goods, if you really want to. Alright, so we have our population, we have our buying power, and I'll just go ahead and spell this all the way out. I just use PP for shorthand. Alright, what climate are we in? Good question. 3, what's 3? Temperate forest. Alright, temperate forest. How very traditionally European of us. And let's get this, especially since we have a city, we want a geographic location for this. Actually, do I want to use this one? Or do I want to use... because I think there's a more finite one in here, right? Yeah. Let's use this one, actually, instead. I have the 1d6 that's meant for like villages and stuff, but this is specifically meant for cities, which is why I want to use it. Alright, so the city's on a coastal peninsula. One of the reasons I use it is that cities and capitals are more likely to show up on rivers or on the coast. One of those two. Even better if it's at the mouth of a river on the coast. And if you think about in history and where many of our large cities are today, yeah, that makes sense, right? Even from the examples I stated earlier, right? We have New York City's definitely on the mouth of the Hudson, right? And Paris is on the Seine, but it's an island on the Seine, so it's actually like Le Havre. And something else is actually on the sea, but on the river, upriver, not very far from the coast, right? Not very far from the coast, indeed. That kind of gives you an idea of like where these sort of larger cities happen. We'll skip that part. So then I like to do like who's in charge, right? What sort of government kind of runs this place? So D10. Alright, so we've got 9. A council. Oh, so a council of elders. Interesting. So let's put 1 by 8. That's really interesting for a city that's run by just a council of elders. Interesting. Alright, what is this place known for? 2. Alcohol. What kind of alcohol do we think that is? It could be... based off of the geography, probably not wine. Right, since we're in the temperate forest region and we're not in sort of the scrubland region, which is where wine grows best. Grapes grow best. And that's sort of like sandy, loamy earth. Which is definitely not sort of the biome we're in. So it could be mead, right? It could be honey. Could be certainly ale or beer for sure. Yeah, maybe a barley wine. Barley wine sounds kind of nice. Maybe a barley wine. Let's say barley wine. I'll just put this in here. Which is, barley wine, if you've never had it, is sort of interesting. Most of the time it's unfiltered, right? It's kind of a wine but instead of grapes, it's made with barley, as the name would lead you to believe, right? It's interesting. It doesn't really... But because the nature of it and the way it's made, it doesn't really feel like beer, which is what the most common sort of barley drink is, right? Typically doesn't have hops in it, I think. Barley wine doesn't. So it's got more of an ale sort of malt kind of thing going on. But yeah, that's what this place is known for. So good to know. So what are the defenses of this place? Usually, I mean, the defenses in general aren't that important as far as sort of like a D&D aspect goes, right? It's probably not going to be that important. But why I like to include it is that I like to include it specifically because it's going to probably be the first thing that the party's going to see when they roll up to a city. So they should know if it's like highly defensible or not. Alright, 8. So it's definitely going to have a keep with the perimeter wall and defensive towers. This is pretty strong defense. That also tells us quite a bit about the city. So any city that's got, any settlement that's got pretty strong defenses means that it's got a history of being attacked. Because most people, just building a wall around the city is a massive undertaking. And that undertaking means that those are not people who are out like working in the fields and doing other things. They're busy building a wall. And so you've got to really kind of need that wall to warrant people diverting labor to build a wall instead of doing whatever they would normally be doing. So that kind of gives us some information as far as that's concerned. Alright, and the law structure. You know, this is actually something that I include, but I usually skip over because it's usually not that important actually in play. But it's nice to have if you need it. It does kind of... Alright, so we rolled a 4. That's... Because it can run into some weird things in this table where you can end up with something like secular-based laws that are strict. Secular-based laws that are strict but might be run by a religious conclave or something like that. So that can be kind of weird. Dwarven Underground Venice, yeah. That's actually a really quite good one. That'd be a fun one to do, for sure. It's definitely, I could see... Most of this document is kind of meant to do surface level stuff. Like, I would know going into it if I was going to be building something underground or not, right? Usually for a Dwarven Hold or something like that, I look at more... something that's more akin to like dungeon creation necessarily than city creation. But I did run a very fun dwarven based dungeon that was sort of a hollowed out mountain that has sort of, like you said, an underground sort of like log flume that kind of goes through it, because they were using it to sort of like make giant ice blocks and cut it and use sort of rivers throughout, sort of canals throughout their sort of hold to move these giant blocks of ice. So yeah, it's a very fun idea, and my players had fun kind of trying to figure out what was going on until they finally got to the ice cutting room, and then they were like, oh, okay. Now I understand. So we have the secular based laws. They're strict. It's good, that means there's not going to be a lot of leeway when they get in trouble with the authorities, which, you know, if you have player characters, I mean, you probably have that one person in your group who's probably going to get into it with the law, probably going to do something silly, right? Most groups have that one sort of like instigator person, right? It's like, I'm going to get in trouble with the law. I'm going to pick all the pockets. I'm going to do all the weird stuff that I probably shouldn't be doing. And then kind of going with that, let's determine a crime rate. Which is really fun, like, especially like I was talking about, like that instigator player. If you have somebody in your group who wants to pull that full rogue or has that criminal background or something like that, and they really want to do that sort of thing, it can be really interesting on both sides. Ooh, roll 10. Whether it's really, really got a lot of crime or it doesn't have a lot of crime, and sort of play up that aspect with them. Okay, so we have a high crime rate, and it's mostly organized. Very interesting. So maybe our right now we have the ruling body for our settlement for our city is a council of elders, but maybe it's like a meeting of sort of like the mafiosa kind of thing. That would be very interesting, right? That's a very interesting take on the city. It has very sort of southern Italy, Sicily kind of vibes to it, right? Right, we have here organized crime includes street gangs, illicit guilds, crime families, etc., etc. The idea that it is most certainly organized. So if we had that PC character who's out there being like, I'm going to rob things, I'm going to make up a lot of trouble and draw a lot of attention, not only are they going to run into problems with the actual authorities, but they might run into problems with the crime families as well, the sort of syndicates, for like sort of unsanctioned criminal activity. And then we do our punishments. Actually, I'm just gonna. This says 1d10, but it really should be 2d10. And so basically for these, I roll 2d10, and then whatever the more severe punishment is, that will be sort of like a major crime felony sort of punishment. And then whatever the lower one is, that's sort of like for misdemeanors. Okay, 10 and 3. Alright, public humiliation and shaming, and community service, or indentured servitude. Which do I think? What do you think? More likely, if it's... We go with public humiliation and shaming as being sort of the... as being sort of like the misdemeanor. And I'm going to go with indentured servitude. As sort of like the felony. Of our minor and major crimes. So again, if you have watched our solo RPG series with Leah, you definitely know that community service was one of the things that she ran into and she and Omer had to do, you know, for basically self-defense manslaughter. Because that's what happens when you get attacked in a temple in a city, and then you fear for your life and you end up having to kill the person. Which is what happened there, right? But they did their community service, they paid off their debts to society, and then they got the heck out of Carjuntan, right? Before they got punished again for breaking and entering. This time on purpose. Right? Alright, so we have some urban settlements. So we do have an urban settlement, we have a city. So cities have down here 1d6 wards. See how many sort of like areas there are in the city. 2. Alright, so there's just 2 areas. We've got 2 wards in the city. Pretty simple. I'm gonna add another thing in there so we can just kind of divide it up a little bit. Alright, so let's do 2d12 for our different wards. 4 and 7. Alright, so there's sort of a... We know this is on the coastal peninsula, so that makes sense that there is a... There's docks ward, and there is a government ward. District, area, whatever you want to call it. So those are our 2 big ones. So obviously when we run into something it's like a capital city, we're going to end up with quite a few, right? Capital cities have 1d6 plus 6 because they're huge cities. But this city only has a population of about 20,000, so it's got a relatively small aspect to it. As far as wards are concerned. And then we can kind of break this down into each different ward. Alright, so we're definitely going to have one. No, which is probably, sorry, I'm kind of jumping ahead. So 1d20 notable buildings. So this is kind of based, again, off that medieval demographics made easy, where we kind of look at where there are inns or taverns or public houses. So in a city, there's definitely one guaranteed. And then we'll just see if there are any extras. Alright, so we're going to have... I assume it would be in the docks area and not in the government board area. So there's one inn. Guaranteed, right? A tavern or public house. But yeah, so I'll do one tavern here and then one tavern in the other district. And we're using the term tavern very loosely. Like, it could be an ale house. It doesn't necessarily have to sell wine, which is what a tavern technically does. Basically, it's the old taverna, which is Latin, I think, in its root, and basically means a place that serves wine. And then our last one is sort of a worship center. So we're guaranteed to have one worship center. That's it. Alright, so I think the one worship center is definitely in the government area, not down by the docks. This could be some sort of temple or church or cathedral, whatever it is. And there we go. Actually, we can give this one advantage. 8. Alright, so we have a small temple or church. We'll just put small temple. So I think the docs make sure this is definitely an ale house, and then this is going to be our barley wine tavern. Right, because that's our specialty in the city, right? They're known for their barley wine. And probably specifically the barley wine that's served in this one tavern. Right, 10%. Talked about that already. Oh, our history and current events. Let's do our history. And we'll do this backwards. So it'll be the current. We call sort of like the current threat is usually what I call it. Then sort of like the recent trouble, and then the sort of like old problems or whatever you want to call it. So that last one is the one that, so again, just kind of going over it. So the current threat is sort of like what's kind of going on in the city now. The recent trouble is something that happened months or a few years ago. And then sort of the old problems are like things that are remembered by only sort of like the very elderly population of the settlement. So things that have happened like decades ago. So let's use our threats. So we've got, they're all D20 rolls. We'll just do them all at one time. 19. None. Okay, so current threat, none. Peaceful. Things are going great in our little city. What was our recent trouble? 4 barbarian raiders. That makes sense. Remember that the city definitely has walls. It's pretty well defended, so that makes sense. Probably because these barbarian incursions keep happening. So things have been eerily silent lately. Maybe something's coming soon. Maybe a new horde. And a natural disaster. What kind of natural disaster do we want? For a temperate forest on a coastal peninsula, fire comes to mind, right? Some sort of fire. But we used a fire in the example, so let's use something else, maybe. We'll use fire and flooding in the previous example. So something that's not that. Maybe an earthquake? Earthquake or pestilence? I think pestilence is on here though, right? Yeah, pox. Oh, you know what? Let's do a tsunami. Tsunami or hurricane? Tsunami or hurricane? Wait, now I'm double checking myself. I said tsunami, let's do tsunami. I already put it down. A great wave came in and wrecked a whole bunch of the city. And only, like, the very old people in the city remember that time. The nice thing about this is that, like, the history is not just something that you can talk to people about in town, is that you can use it for those sort of, like, little bits of experiential world building where you're, like, going through and you'd be like, oh, you realize that, like, the closer you get towards the water line, the newer the buildings seem to be in the town. Oh, I wonder why that is. And they start talking to people and they're like, oh, well, yeah, there was a tsunami that came in, like, 60 years ago and wiped out, like, half the town. Wiped out half the city. But things have been very peaceful now. I mean, besides, you know, we ran into some barbarian raider problems, you know, a few years back. But that went away. I'm sure they won't come back. I'm sure that won't be a problem that heroes will need to solve. And then we sort of do the nearby locations. We'll do north, northeast, east, southeast, south, southwest, west, and northwest. And this, I just use the same POI, the same points of interest that we use for the hex crawl when we do the solo RPG. So it's a D20, and then I usually just do a D12 for how far away it is. We'll just do that. Ooh, 20. Natural 20. So a treasure roomer to the north. Seven leagues away. Interesting. Some sort of marker. Oh, I realize I haven't updated this since I changed some of the POI stuff. That's okay. So it's going to be some sort of signage of some sort. We'll say it's some sort of warning sign. That's about 4 leagues away. What's to the east? $15. Some sort of land farm. Okay. Interesting. Well, a D6, that'll tell me. I know we're in a civilized area. Okay, some sort of... Alright, so there's some sort of artificial land form. So that's what I roll sometimes. So I have things broken down by sort of like artificial, natural, or weird. and depending on sort of like the general location, sort of vibe of the area. So this is sort of like, we're in a city, so it's definitely in a civilized sort of area. So whatever landform we're going to see is going to be artificial. So it's going to be some sort of monument or something. It might be sort of like a Stonehenge situation where there's sort of dolmens or menhirs or obelisks or totems or something of that nature. We don't need to know that right now, but if we were playing it, I would probably figure out what that was going to be. Unless they didn't ask about it. I might wait till they ask about it and be like, oh, there's a gigantic sort of like, it could be like a Moag kind of thing. Like, oh, there's this gigantic carved head that just kind of sits out on a hill all by itself. Oh, well, that sounds like something interesting to go check out, right? Then you can find your way to adventure that way. 8. Religious location. So that religious location, it could be some sort of cloister, right? It could be sort of like a monastery or nunnery or something like that. It could be sort of like a religious commune. It might be a shrine that's off by itself. It might be some sort of like miracle location, minor miracle location, something like that. Could be anything. Could be like a healing spring, right? A blessed spring or something like that. Could be a lot of different things. Give you a lot of options with these sort of rules. $17 and 10. No trespassing area. So when I come across something like this, and I know that they've got this history of barbarian raids, and they have these stout defenses, that makes me think that the sort of barbarian horde area is about 10 leagues to the south, right? That's sort of the area that they sort of rule over, and those are sort of like hill people, Bedouin sort of itinerant sort of community or whatever it is. And to the southwest. 6. Ooh, cool, we got a monster lair. Well, you know, maybe I spoke too soon about the barbarian thing. Maybe the monster lair is really why they have the... Now, again, I can roll that d6 based off of our area. Okay, that's 3. That's definitely humanoid. Well, it could be humanoid. Doesn't necessarily have to be humanoid. But there is an artificial monster lair. So artificial includes anything that's sort of like humanoid. It also includes things that are made by humanoids. So like constructs fall into that. So maybe there's just a weird construct that lives out there all by itself, which could be a fun adventure, right? These are basically adventure ideas. These are all sort of hooks that people can grab onto. Be like, oh yeah, we can talk about, you know, right? We could even do that with the artificial landform if we wanted to do it in construct. Maybe it's just this gigantic robotic hand that's like sticking out of the ground, right? That could be it. And you know, maybe your players are like, oh, definitely want to check that out, see what that's all about, right? That sort of thing. Be really cool. Let me see. So for the west, what's to the west of our little settlement here? 20 again. What was 20? Oh, a treasure rumor. I love treasure rumors. Because treasure rumors could be real, right? They could be false. It's got a very sort of like, at least in my mind, it brings to... conjures up images of things like Treasure Island, sort of like maps with an X marked on them, and you go there and you're like, oh, there was never any treasure, or there was treasure but it was dug up long ago, or, you know, maybe there is treasure there, maybe it's a trap, who knows what it is, right? it was planted by somebody. I ran a game in which the PCs had done something that brought the ire of some dwarves in the community. I can't remember. They said something vaguely racist, I think, if I remember correctly, about dwarves. And there's a pretty significant dwarven population in this one's sort of small settlement. And so they made up a fake treasure rumor to use as sort of like an opportunity to draw the party out into an area and then ambush them. They ended up never following up on that treasure rumor. They got busy with the actual adventure that was going on. But those are also cool things you can do with treasure rumors, right? Feel like this is a way that people lead people into an ambush. It could be all sorts of weird stuff. And one, which I think is beginner signal. Okay. So I think if we're doing a beacon to the northeast and we know that we're on a coastal peninsula, that's probably going to be some sort of lighthouse, which may be on the land, may be off on an island by itself. I just watched a very fun, let me see if I can, well, no, I'm not going to bring it up, but if you ever watched Max Miller and Tasting History on YouTube, he just brought out a video recently about corn chowder for lighthouse keepers, and talks about lighthouse keepers and their propensity for going, insane. And talking about the movie with Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson, where they play a lighthouse keeper and lighthouse keeper assistant as they go kind of crazy by themselves on an island, just the two of them. And now, looking back on it, one thing that I didn't know until I watched that video was that apparently the sort of like turning mechanism for the actual beacon in the lighthouse sat on a vat of mercury. It was like, oh, well, yeah, no wonder, like, if they were having to provide service and maintenance to a vat of mercury in sort of like the 19th century, yeah, no wonder they were going insane, right? Mad as a Hatter, right? Mercury was used to sort of shape hats back in the 18th and 19th century, and so hatters had a propensity for going insane, and so then it makes sense that lighthouse keepers also went insane. On top of them spending a lot of time alone most of the time, right? Like 99% of the time they were alone. So, yeah, not great times, I guess, for them. Seems like in retrospect, looking at it, it was like, who would ever agree to do that job? Also, apparently, it was just hard work. So we did our POIs. So now we have some settlement naming conventions. So we can actually name our city. Pretty standard naming conventions. So, all right. So how many words are in our name? 2. So I think there's just one. Oh, it's 2. All right. So we got 2 words. Then make up the name of our city. More d6. All right. 6 and 6. All right. Prevalent flora and fauna. Interesting. Alright, so prevalent flora and fauna. Which makes me think, temperate forest, maybe some sort of fish. And we know it's a forest. Maybe it's some sort of tree. Oh, that's a weird one to put together. I kind of want to re-roll it because that's so weird. They have both prevalent flora and fauna. Yeah, I think I'm gonna re-roll that. Don't be afraid to re-roll if things get weird. Like, I was thinking I could do something like... something like halibut kelp or... something like that, but that's sort of a weird name. So we're going to keep one of those, and then we're going to roll it again. 5. Alright, local historical person or event. Alright, well, we had the tsunami. That's probably the most current event, right? So we have the tsunami. The thing we're gonna do, maybe something like Teacher's Crest. I'm good with that. I like that. I only think that I think about names, especially when it comes to naming places, is that kind of go with your instinct. I think if you think about it for too long, you'll start to really second guess yourself, and it turns like a few minute process into like a 15-minute process of trying to name things. So, Beecher's Crest. So, crest for the waves, beech for the type of tree, Beecher's Crest. There we go. And then we could go in, we could name these inns and ale houses if we wanted to. The tavern and the temple. We figure out what god it venerates, one or more. We can do all that stuff, but we don't really need to do that stuff unless it's going to be important for our game. So, I mean, we rolled for some of that stuff randomly in the solo RPG, and that's how we ended up with an inn called the Regular Trout. Which, ironically, I kind of love. I kind of love that there's just this place that's called the Regular Trout. It's such a terrible name. But you know, there's places that have terrible names and good names. Not everything has to be good names. I think about it because recently I also came up with... I need to come up with an inn for a city that I was running, and I came up with the Calico Hand, which is a much, much better name. And so I'm like, on one hand... Ha ha ha, pun. On one hand we have the Regular Trout, and then on the other hand, we have the Calico Hand. It was like, these things are the same thing, but they feel so very different. Regular Trout's just such a weird name. But now I've come to really enjoy it, and I'll never forget it, probably, because it's so dumb. And that's actually okay, because one of the things that you find out if you start to really think about how specifically places are named, we're not particularly original as a species when it comes to naming things. We have all sorts of very, very dumb names, right? Cold Creek, we have Shallow Water, we have Black Forest. We don't actually come up with particularly interesting names for places. So if the name of your place feels a little flat, that's probably okay in most chances. Especially if it's not a place that you're planning to hang around for a while. I think that's perfectly fine. To have a kind of a basic name for a basic place. But yeah, so that's sort of how I go through and I make these guys real quick. We could do the mutation, I guess, real quick. So the mutation is basically like, if you have to think about how long the place has been here. So the longer that a place has been around, the more likely it is for their name to sort of change and augment over time. You kind of do that by kind of like smushing stuff together. So we have Beecher's Crest. So I'd probably shorten it to something like Beecrest. Because that's sort of what you do after a time. It's sort of like if you ever play like a tongue twister, it's like how fast can you say something till it starts to screw up. If you do that with the name of your place, you're going to figure out what the name was probably going to turn of your place will probably turn into after a lot of time. So we can turn it from Beecher's Crest into Beecrest. Super easy. And I even shortened it to Beckrest. 1.2. Maybe even Beakest. I don't really like that. I like Beckrest better. I'm going to leave it as Beecrest. I'm going to make that a BA, Beecrest, because I don't want it to make it feel like you're expecting B's to be there, because if I had been smart and we had done for the known for its alcohol and done mead instead, Beecrest would have been a great name for it. But I didn't do that. Though I guess we could change it, right? Let's change it. Don't let a good idea just pass you by. Okay. This is a place that's known for its mead, and it's named Beecrest. Done. So yeah, that's usually how I make sort of small towns. The nice thing is that I really like doing that portion at the end where we talk about sort of like local places that are nearby. Because each one of these, let me highlight them real quick. Each one of these little guys can be its own sort of adventure hook. Right, could be the treasure roomer. Now we have 2 treasure roomers, so they might be the same treasure roomer, which would be really fun. We've got the landform, we've got the religious location, we've got the no trespassing area, which is probably our barbarian hordes. But we also have the artificial monster lair, so maybe they have, right, that could be part of the barbarians, it could be separate. Like, maybe they have a stronghold to the southwest, maybe they don't. Right, we can figure that out while we play, right? That's one of the cool things as DMs. If we want to improvise that, that's totally fine. But just kind of doing this little bit and sort of putting that all together can give you an idea about how to make a settlement pretty quickly. Right, you can make a settlement using this relatively quickly. And once you do that, and this is a city, right? This is a relatively large one. And then we can do all sorts of extra stuff. Let's just go over the settlement stuff. Look at some of the extra stuff we could add in here if we really wanted to. If we were going to spend some real time here, we start looking at things like, what is their primary industry? Well, we talked about it already. It's probably the mead, right? But it might not be. It might be a secondary thing. So, why don't we check? You know, we could sort of like beef this up a little bit. So I rolled a 14. Oh, okay, so their primary export is sort of medicinal. Let's put it in here. But it's not really what the city is known for, which is kind of interesting. But, you know, the medicinal arts, as far as honey is concerned, honey can be actually quite important to the medical field based off of the inherent nature of it. It's antimicrobial, so it's really good for sort of like salves and cuts and abrasions, things of that nature. Could be a dietary thing, right? Right. Unfiltered honey is supposed to be good for people who suffer from allergens, right? That sort of thing. There's lots of stuff you can do with honey. We don't need to know about roads. I mean, we could. I'm not going to make a map for the city. I usually don't get down to the point where I'm making actual like street by street maps of a city. If you want to do that, I would recommend checking out Vornheim. I'll put it right here. Yeah, I know. I would say check out Vornheim. There's a really, really great supplement from Zach, who puts out Lamentations of the Flame Princess. So they're sort of like old school heavy metal kind of RPG kind of thing. And Vornheim is very much that, but Vornheim has a lot of really great sort of like city building tips for you, even if you're not trying to do that style. And one of my favorite ones, because that's what made me think of it, with making streets and stuff like that, they talk about using letters to make streets. So S-C-A-R, so if you want to make Scar, and then you can kind of mutate that a little bit, and then you can figure out how those streets kind of fit together, which is a really fun way to sort of like build the streets, and then you can just pepper the buildings in around those streets. So if you make sort of like a word salad, a letter salad, right? You could then figure out what the layout of the streets are in your city very easily. And so yeah, I have a lot of information about like naming streets. It's not that important. It's just fun stuff. It's extra fun stuff. Like if I have extra time to prep, then I might do something like that. Like how wide are the roads and things like that. Have a D60 table for naming roads, right? All that sort of fun stuff. Like I said, this is very into it, like in the weeds kind of document that I need to refer to when I need just random stuff. Government time, we've looked at that. With our power players, which here we've used our VIP NPCs kind of create. But you could also use the... Actually, I didn't include VIP NPCs, did I? Sorry. That's my fault. I don't even think there... Are there 100 in here? No, there's technically 96. Alright, let's make some power players. I didn't include those. Let's do that. So I usually like to make one per ward, but 3 minimum. So let's just make 3 minimum, because we only have 2 wards. Alright, so 48. Okay. Alright, so the treasury. That makes sense. Alright, a lot of these are actually institutions rather than specific people. Yeah, undoubtedly the treasury holds a lot of money, a lot of sway over what happens in the city. Alright, 5. Sort of civic assembly. So we talked about that so we know that this place is run by a council of elders, but there's also a civic assembly as well. So it might be some sort of like, maybe in one of the specific wards, maybe in... Right, if we assume that the Council of Elders in the government ward, then maybe the dock ward has its own sort of civic assembly. Be really cool. Hey, how are you doing? We're just going through, we're finishing up a little city we're building real quick. If you're having a good day. And let's roll one more. and 10. Ooh, the Privy Council. So, for those of you who watched Game of Thrones, you should be familiar with the Privy Council. They're basically sort of like the short council for the bureaucracy of the city, right? Those are sort of three people, the power players that we have, right? All of them are institutions, none of them are actual people that take precedence in our city. Very interesting. Was not expecting that. Let's see, what else we got in here? We can also do it with markets and shops too. So if you really want to flesh out the districts, I do this where, right, we're doing a city, so we treat each district as a steading. Alright, so no important shops. Good to know. Sometimes that's how the rolls go. Oh, you're working on some D&D items and quests? Nice. Very nice. Very nice. So, magic items, or what kind of items are you working on for your D&D game? We don't really need to do the cast and focus. We do theme or feel. Most of these are for like a relatively large, like the reason that I have such an in-depth resource is that most of this is for like running more of a campaign that takes place almost entirely within like one city. So you need a lot of detail for that. But in most D&D campaigns, right, you're only going to stay in the city for a little bit of time. Most of the time you're going to do like what, maybe one adventure in a city, maybe two. And then you're going to push off and go to a dungeon or something like that. Well, yeah, I mean, I think most magic items are, by nature, relatively unbalanced. So don't feel that bad about it. So assume you're playing 5th edition D&D and not like Pathfinder or 4th edition, 3rd edition, whatever. In 5th edition, the magic items aren't as important. What's really most important is the ability to bypass non-magical resistance for most weapons. So as long as they can do their magic weapons, that works out really well. Otherwise, you can just kind of have fun with most of the magic items in 5e. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that kind of goes in here, like academics and the health and sanitation services of specific wards. If you really want to dig into each individual ward and kind of make it its own thing, really give it its own sort of like flavor and feel, you can kind of do that. Well, we could do this part. We hadn't done this. So you can see right here, I have the fading current and incoming. Very, very similar. Very similar stuff. But for the crises or threats, let's do sort of like, we've got the background, and we do know that it's known for its alcohol. Is there any sort of like you gotta see it kind of things? Some sort of landmark. I don't know. I don't think I'm going to include anything for that right now. I think if this was something I was actually going to play, I'd sit down and think about that a little bit. And then think about what exactly I'd want to do was sort of like a touristy, like, oh, you need to see this while you're in the town. I think the Barley Wine Tavern is probably going to suffice for that. In fact, I'll just add that on here as sort of like the gotta see location. We'll put this down as the tourist destination. Is that Barley Wine Tavern, since they're known for their barley wine. Sorry, they're known for their mead. We changed that. It's no longer barley wine. Not the Mean Tavern. Everybody's just really nasty in that tavern. They're really hateful. No, the Mead Tavern. Right, we have things where you can do like prevalent dining, entertainment, all that sort of stuff. And again, this is the sort of stuff that I do if I was going to run this camp, run this city as sort of like an ongoing place that the party was going to come back to again and again and again. They were going to spend a lot of time here. Because you want to... When you're prepping for D&D, it's very much sort of like the life advice about how to spend your money, which is the idea that you spend your money where you spend your time. And so if your players aren't going to spend a lot of time in the city, we don't want to spend a lot of time prepping for that city, right? Same sort of idea. So if I was like, oh, well, I'm going to run a mostly urban campaign setting, right? Most of the adventure is going to happen in the city, then I'd spend a lot more time fleshing out the city and its different districts. Which again is why I have this big document for it. We did that. We've already talked about naming conventions. I just got some examples here. Very similar to what we're doing right here. Yeah, alright, that's everything that's in there. Very cool. Alright, well, I am just going to drop this off. Let's drop us back into chatting real quick. Because, yeah, that was basically everything I wanted to go over. So we have, just to sort of give a review of everything we did with our sort of example. So we made our city called Beecrest. It has a population of about 20,000 people in it, which means it has a buying power of about 2,000 gold pieces, which is the amount that you can... the cost of items you can buy or sell easily, right? So that brings us... actually, let me look at my DM binder real quick. I can tell you, which means that as far as this is concerned, as far as buying magical items, you could buy... you could buy most uncommon... Actually, I think you could buy all uncommon items here. Just kind of off the shelf. So if you're looking for an uncommon item in a city of this size, you're going to be able to easily find it. You may also be able to find some minor magical items. Some minor rare magical items. Not just normal magical items, but rare magical items. But that's, again, you're going to have to do sort of your division there to see, because it's going to be a percentage roll to see if you can actually find it or not. Or you use that cool downtime activity where you go searching for a specific type of magic item, which is a fun downtime activity that's in, I'm looking at my bookshelf, Xanatar's Guide, I'm pretty sure, is what that's in. But let's get back to Beecrest. We have Beecrest as the buying power of 2,000 gold pieces, city population of about 20,000. It's in a temperate forest on a coastal peninsula. It's run by a council of elders. Oh yeah. No worries. Go. Good luck prepping for your stuff. We know that it's run by a council of elders, which may or may not be mafioso, might be some sort of organized crime families. It's known specifically for its alcohol, its mead output, and its primary export It's not meat, it's actually medicinal arts, which again may be highly related to honey, right? Which has a lot of very good health benefits, both for ingestion and sort of like topical applications. So we ended up with a city that has 2 districts in it. It has a docks district and a government district. In the docks ward, we have 1 inn, and we have an ale house. And then in the government ward, we ended up with 1 mead tavern, which is sort of like the big tourist destination that people kind of brings in the tourist people. It's kind of the tourist trap of the city. And 1 small temple devoted to a god to be determined at a later time. And we also have some power players, which are sort of our VIP NPCs. I'm just going to write that down here. So these are the sort of people that you want to bring the party into contact with, so they can deal, because they're sort of like the movers and shakers of this settlement. The first part is the Treasury Department, so the people who, control the money that comes in and out of the city. Very important people to get in right with, and definitely have lots of stuff going on. We have the Civic Assembly, and this is at the docks, so they're basically the local area that kind of runs, or sort of like the local administrative council that sort of helps run the docks. It's sort of like I think it's probably more like a chamber of commerce kind of situation, but it's a civic assembly for the docks specifically. And then in the government side, we have the Privy Council, which are sort of like the small council from Game of Thrones that are sort of like the high-level bureaucrats that help those in charge take care of everything. They're the execution arm of the people in charge. I just lost my place. Oh, history. So we have a little bit of history for the place, for our city, for Beecrest. So currently, there's nothing going on in the city. Things are peaceful, maybe deceptively so, right? Given that the recent trouble they've had in the last few months and or years is barbarian raiders, which may be to the south and southwest. And then the old problems, the problems that only sort of like the elderly portion of the city remember, is that there was a tsunami that sort of like wiped out a large portion of the city, sort of like in the lowlands area of the city, down by the docks. So everything in the docks is relatively new compared to sort of like old growth in the city, which is going to be sort of obviously on higher ground. And then we have sort of our different sort of kind of looking at putting our settlement right in the middle, and then like what's around our settlement. So to the north is a treasure roomer that's about 7 leagues, so about 7 hours away. The northeast is a warning sign, warning us about something we don't know yet until they go there. It's about 4 leagues away. To the east, we have an artificial landform. Like I said, it could be like a robotic hand sticking out of the ground. It might just be like a totem pole, or a menhir, or a dolmen, or something like that. A geoglyph, petroglyph, something like that. It could be all sorts of weird stuff. It could be some sort of, to the southeast, we have a religious location. That could be a shrine, a temple, a cloister, a site of a minor miracle. It could be all sorts of things. To the south, we have a no trespassing area that's 10 leagues away, and we assume that that is where our barbarians are living. And to the southwest, we have an artificial monster lair, which is 4 leagues away, which we think may be the barbarian sort of stronghold. Maybe they have like a ring fort on a hill or something. And so those may be connected, but not necessarily. We won't know until they get there, right? I like to leave things real loosey-goosey until the players sort of like take a bite on whatever the adventure hook is, right? They take the bait and they sink their mouth into the hook, and once they do that and we're following that, then I can flesh out that area more. But I don't want to spend a lot of time like coming up with the monster layer and everything that's in the monster layer and having this whole adventure mapped out just for the players to be like, that doesn't really seem interesting. I think we're just going to follow this treasure rumor to the west. And like I said, there's a treasure rumor to the west that's about 2 leagues away. And be like, oh, I did all this prep work, and now none of that's important because you guys are deciding to do something else. So yeah, just try to keep things loosey-goosey until my players sort of like zoom in, like focus in on one specific thing they want to chase down and be like, okay, now I'll prep that thing, rather than trying to prep all these things. And then to finish us off, to the northwest, we have a beacon that's about 8 leagues away. And considering that we are on a coastal peninsula, we said that this beacon is most likely a lighthouse. And that's everything we kind of need to know about Beacrest. That's it. And so yeah, that's sort of how I go about sort of making settlements. When I need more than just sort of like the 5 R's, right? We need the rest, we need resupply, we need report. I'm trying to remember the R's off the top of my head. Like, I know what they are, but I can't remember the R words for them. So we need rest, we need report, we need resupply, we need recreation, and we need... Oh, what's the other R? Oh, research. That's the other R. I was like, there's something else. What is it? Oh, it's research, right? The ability to sort of like come up with rumors and adventure books and that sort of thing. So yeah, if you have to come up with a settlement on the fly, or your players are rolling into town for the first time for a city or village or whatever it is that you haven't prepped yet, just focus on those 5 R's right off the bat. And then, if you have some prep time, kind of do this other thing that we talked about, where we kind of come up with all the extra stuff about it. Especially if they're going to spend some time in that area. And then, the more time that they're going to spend in that area, the more you have the opportunity to flesh it out. Don't feel like you need to do, like 5 hours of work, like getting all the way down to like basically a street level map for every ward of this massive city, if you're only expecting the players to be there for like a couple of sessions before they move on. So prep what's most important for the game, right? Even though it's fun, right? I enjoy making cities and being like, oh, this shop's over here, and oh, there's a food cart that sells this, and all that fun stuff. Like, I enjoy that stuff for the prep side, but I also enjoy the prep side. But I have to sort of rein it in sometimes and be like, alright, I need to focus specifically on what I think the players are going to do in the next session based off of what they've told me. And then if they keep coming back to here, then I can keep doing that. But, yeah, that's everything when it comes down to settlements. Hope you guys had a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun. It's always fun to sort of like build this stuff and show off this stuff. I have a lot of fun doing it and seeing what's going to come out of it. I can already look at Beacrest and be like, oh, I can come up with some adventures here. Like, I can for sure come up with many, many sessions worth of adventures just based off of this, for sure. Which is definitely what I want. I want to prep resources that are just going to sort of like light up my mind. It's going to be like, oh, you get my synapses firing and being like, okay, now I want to do this and this and this and this and this, right? But I hope you guys had fun. I had fun. Again, earlier we did the Session 17 solo RPG with Leo. We're finally getting back to it. It's a lot of fun. They're chasing down Ott. They all fell in a hole except for the mule. All except for the mule, and so that was a lot of fun. and silly. But yeah, so we'll pick that up next week. I'm going to try to do some more streams like this one, where I focus on some not as much solo RPG stuff to just kind of see what everybody's like. If you want to see more of this sort of content, or you want to catch up with all the solo RPG stuff, you can go check all that stuff out on YouTube. I had my own website up with a whole bunch of blogs. I've been doing the blog for like over 10 years. So if you want more DMs sort of stuff, that's the best place to go for that information. But yeah, check out the videos, check out the DM stuff, follow me on Twitter, follow me here, subscribe on the YouTube channel. wherever you see my glowing face, make sure that you subscribe, like, and do all that good stuff. And I will talk to you guys next time. All right? Bye.